A new power saver mode has rolled out to PlayStation 5 games this week, to Demon's Souls, Days Gone Remastered, and Death Stranding 2, which has all running in a unique power throttled state. Sony advertises this as part of its drive to reduce greenhouse emissions by 2050, with a lot of milestones en route, but more appetizing is the prospect that, hypothetically, this power saver mode is our first glimpse at how PS5 games are set to run on a future PlayStation Portable system, where games will demand a stripped-down power profile. Developers need to implement this power saver mode on a title-by-title basis, and they're coming thick and fast, with every day this week seeing a power saver mode being added to a new title. Today then, we checked out Demon's Souls and Days Gone Remastered, where the approach to using this power saver mode seems to differ in some fascinating ways. So to help me break down how this power saver mode works, I'm joined by Rich Ledbetter. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of power testing on this to see what the actual power savings are. And obviously, I'm all in on handhelds, right? I find the whole technology really, really fascinating. And the prospect of a PlayStation handheld, well, you know, Vita's PSP, kind of legendary. So I'm really looking forward to that. We do think it is actually happening at this point, even though there's been no official announcements yet. And this power saver mode, it's obviously limiting the existing PlayStation 5 technology in a number of ways. There's been a leak from Moore's Law is Dead, which we've now independently checked and verified. And yeah, let's take a look at those specs, how it's reducing the base PlayStation 5 specification for this power saver mode. First of all, CPU usage is limited to 8 threads, down from 16. Now, the nature of that reduction, I believe that it's actually effectively taking an 8-core 16-thread setup to a 4-core 8-thread setup, which is, again, a match for the leaked PlayStation handheld specifications. GDDR6 memory has been downclocked to effectively half speed, half bandwidth then, which is a major challenge that developers are going to have to work with there. There's also been talk that clocks are going to be reduced, right? And I believe the leaks were suggesting that both CPU and GPU clocks are going to be reduced by about 10 to 20%. All I can really verify at this point is that the GPU clock will be running at what Sony describes as base frequency. And we don't know what that base frequency is, but I guess 10 to 20% is a pretty good guess, right?
Yeah.
And CPU clock, I didn't actually see any notes on the reduction of clock speed there, but it is variable on the base PlayStation 5, and I suspect that just lowering that to whatever the base frequency may be would be a good strategy. But I didn't see that in any documentation that I've seen. The console is also limited to 36 compute units, which isn't a big deal for the PlayStation 5 because it has 36 compute units. But for the professional model, which has 60, obviously it's paring that back. So by that token, you won't see any extra performance, or maybe you will, but nothing game-changing from the Pro running in power saver mode. There's no PSSR functions available, no VR support. 3D audio processing is reduced to 75% of its capacity. So that's basically the lie of the land in terms of how a base PlayStation 5, which typically runs in excess of 200 watts, is going to become this power saver version, which is going to be running in the sort of 100 watt territory. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that the base PlayStation 5 for developers is considered one device, right? And then the professional, which is codenamed Trinity, that's another device. The power saver mode effectively becomes a third device in that hierarchy, right at the bottom of the hierarchy, of course, but that's how it's kind of like formatted within the developer environment. Even though there is no low power device, this is like a profile that's been set for both of the other devices and may, of course, set the stage for this proposed handheld. But let's talk about the actual games that we're looking at here. We've got two. We've got Demon's Souls and Days Gone, and more are coming, of course. But already we're seeing some interesting variances in how those modes are being deployed, how those pared back resources are being used by developers. So let's start with, I guess, the simpler version, the simpler sort of implementation of Power Saver with Demon's Souls.
Yeah, it is a simple implementation for this one, though obviously this is a PS5 exclusive as opposed to Days Gone Remastered, which was originally a last-gen PS4 title. So there's some differences in terms of the demands, I guess, that I'd put on a system, even with the remastered features on PS5. Well, it works simply by every game now has a green leaf added to the game tile when it has compatibility with the Power Saver mode. And with that, you get a sub-menu which you can open from that tile, and you can choose which games you want to kind of engage with this mode. And also, once you boot the game in power saver mode, if you had it booted before, it will have to restart it. The reason being that the graphics mode options inside of the game do change, and the settings do change, so they need to kind of factor this in. So in Demon's Souls' case, there was obviously the standard 4K 30 mode and the performance mode, which ran at 1440p 60. Those are gone, and with power saver mode, it's replaced with just a power saver option. So it's fairly straightforward, and that applies to base PS5 and PS5 Pro. And the key point to make there is, as you mentioned, Rich, that there's no distinction between base PS5 and Pro here. This is a separate power profile, and the functionality and the way they perform is exactly the same regardless of system. So it makes life a lot easier on our side. It's just we can just focus on base PS5 in this case. So comparisons. In terms of the comparisons between performance mode and the power saver mode, it's very straightforward. This is the performance mode running at 1440p, but now at 30 FPS. So just cleaves that frame rate right in half, which makes sense, right? We're looking for a memory reduction of about 50%, and that's an easy way to accommodate that. Obviously identical on both PS5 and Pro for this. There's no PSSR on Pro. It's just the standard Bluepoint TAA method. And yes, there's parity in terms of settings with the previous 60 FPS performance mode in terms of LODs and everything you could imagine. Every single setting is precisely matched, and the resolution obviously 1440p. And I think just about every other facet of the game is intact, including the physics model of Demon's Souls, which is kind of crucial to the way the game plays. You've got ragdolls, destructible barrels, you've got the collision on striking an enemy. All that is exactly intact from the standard game on power saver mode. So nothing is really affected in terms of playability. And even like loading between areas, there's an initial sort of warp point in the initial tutorial area, and that loads exactly the same speed as without power saver engaged there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically then it is just the performance mode running at 30 frames per second, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you've got that reduced memory bandwidth, and you've got paired back GPU clocks. So that's kind of like probably the easiest way to pair back the game. Just run it at 30 frames per second, job done. But we should check how much of a lock to 30 FPS we get here, because I guess the original game on a base PlayStation 5 and of course the Pro, it was, whether you're choosing the performance or the quality modes, those frame rates were pretty much locked, which isn't quite the case here, right? You managed to come across a scenario where you can actually instigate a performance drop.
Yeah, actually by accident. I will say this is mostly a 30 FPS lock, just as you say. It's on PS5 and Pro. With the power saver mode, it's 30 locked, even frame pacing. Thank goodness. And there's no issue really hitting that for most of what I've played. I took to the first Archstone, and that first Boletaria area has you kind of walk along this initial straight, and I used this to test LOD changes and to see if there was any difference on power saver mode. There isn't. But what it did prove, when I got to the very end, I'd kind of picked up a cluster of enemies behind me, did a full 180-degree turn, and suddenly that performance goes down into the 20s with some tearing as well on the power saver mode. So it's forcing the situation, to be honest. It's not like you're going to be playing this way exactly in a regular run, hopefully. But it did show that there is potentially some limits on the CPU side in handling a lot of enemies, maybe GPU side, because there's some explosions going on as well here. And there was another area later on, always in this exact same spot in the world, where there's a kind of traversal hitch while running kind of in a certain pathway. So potentially, Demon's Souls is a long game. There's a lot to it. There may be more drops, CPU or GPU related, as a result of those throttled specs. And those areas ran flawlessly, as you say, like on the 60 FPS mode without power saver.
Okay, well, let's get to the point of the whole exercise, which is reduced power, right? So actually, synchronized gameplay captures with captures from my watt meter. And here we are, all graphed for your viewing pleasure. And it's pretty good news, right? The game is essentially running at 45 to 50% of power draw from the main PlayStation. It's pretty simple here. You can see how it all plays out. Power saver mode is running well below 100 watts in this particular title, where it's slightly north of 200 watts. So yeah, pretty impressive saving there, I'd say. And you actually get increased, or rather, I was going to say increased, it's actually increased efficiency, I guess, when you're looking at the PlayStation 5 Professional, because you're saving about 6 to 7 watts, I guess, compared to the base unit there. But it is functionally the same. And on the right there, you can see how the standard PlayStation 5 Pro plays out there in terms of power draw. Even though it's a 4nm product, it's still sort of in the same sort of ballpark as the 6nm PS5 Slim I used for testing. Just bear in mind that notoriously my PS5 Slim seems to have no real power savings over a 7nm launch model. But yes, job done basically in terms of reducing the scope of the game and getting the requisite power draw reduced by really decent amount. But we've got to move on to Days Gone Remastered here, because this is a completely different approach. It was very, very basic, I think, with Demon's Souls. It's like, well, okay, you're going to get a 30 FPS experience. What Ben's studio has tried to do here is to replicate the existing modes in the full fat version of the game. And there's some really innovative ideas needed to get the job done here. So what did you see on this one, Tom?
Yeah, they've kept the same modes, the quality mode and the performance mode. So when you boot it on Power Saver, it seems like nothing's changed, except if you're playing on Pro. Then you lose the enhanced mode with PSSR upscaling. So that reverts to kind of basically the base PS5 mode set up there. So we keep the 1440p 60 technically of the performance mode and the 4K 30 of the quality mode, but there is a change to the resolutions in terms of the horizontal pixel counts.
Right.
So on performance mode, that now runs at a lesser 1280 by 1440. So a 50% reduction on the horizontal axis there. With some signs of checkerboard rendering, I noticed, with quick pans and edges that are moving quickly on the side of the screen. On the quality mode side, we still have 4K 30, but there's a more aggressive scale dynamically on the horizontal axis. So it goes from 1920 by 2160 in the lowest worst case up to numbers like 3264 by 2160 in kind of sky shots, looking at places where the GPU load is theoretically at its lowest. And there was a third kind of middle ground test we did with there's a horde mode where you face loads of zombies, and they have that puts the pixel count down to about 2240 by 2160. So a good range, and all of this gives the engine some leeway to adjust for a potential max of 50% bandwidth cut on memory, but it does scale potentially up to a full 4K if you have the headroom, but it's all within this throttled power profile. On top of that, there are a few other settings that Ben Studio has changed. So this is a bit more granular than what we saw with the Demon's Souls optimizations for power saver mode. You've got dropped LOD settings for foliage and trees. So draw distances on foliage across the distance there on the open world will be pruned back. And also ambient occlusion under grass tufts is dropped a setting as well compared to what we had without Power Saver. So some more detailed tinkering, I guess, in this case, which just shows there's a difference in the mentality of how Power Saver has been utilized by developers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about performance now because, aiming to keep 60 FPS in, Power Saver mode, I think that's quite ambitious. One thing which has come to light from developer documentation is that Sony has strongly recommended that VRR is supported in Power Saver mode here, presumably to accommodate for smoothing out performance drops, which are bound to happen when you sort of, reduce the spec by that much. And that's kind of borne out by what we're seeing here with the Days Gone performance mode in Power Saver mode, right? It's targeting 60. I guess you could call it unlocked. It's 60 a lot of the time, but it can drop. And you're kind of in a window that's kind of VRR friendly, I'd say.
Yeah, VRR friendly is definitely a good way to phrase it. Let's say 50 to 60 FPS in there, from pretty much the word go with the bike ride at the start. It's 50 to 60, some stretches at 60 later on, but anything involving broad open world stretches with zombies or that kind of nature of processing, you're going to have some drops. There's also an issue with switching to and from the game's survival mode, survival vision, where you can see items in the scene more easily, more legibly. On the power saver mode, I noticed that dropping quite a lot more, whereas before it was pretty much fine. And our final test really was this horde mode in the challenges.
Yeah, I love this one. It's just carnage.
Great stress test. Really, really love this one for putting so many zombies on screen. You introduced me to this. It was a great way to push this. And yeah, here we get down to 45, near 40 FPS at points, depending on how you move the camera. And it is definitely struggling to hold anything close to 60 in that case. Previously, we had performance mode run this with some hitches on the seat. There were some hitches when explosions kicked off, and that appeared more so in your footage on your PS5 Slim than what I was able to recreate on my regular old OG base PS5. But it was an issue there, and it's kind of amplified by the power saving throttling. They're very interesting result. But you definitely need a VRR display to deal with that. On top of that, it's curious to note, I did testing on PS5 and PS5 Pro in power saver states here, because unlike with Demon's Souls, we actually have a ways to see unlocked performance with wavering frame rates and how they stack up against each other. And there is a difference. There's about a 2 to 3 FPS gain to the better on PS5 Pro with the power saver state. So in theory, if they've tried to lock specs or match specs on PS5 Pro to PS5, there might be a variable somewhere in there which isn't 100% locked in terms of matching it, but it's 2 to 3 FPS difference.
Okay, let's talk about power draw then. This one is interesting because we had that kind of 90 to 95 watt sort of window on Demon's Souls. It's significantly higher on Days Gone Remastered. And yes, I mean, I still can't quite believe that a 6nm PlayStation is drawing 240 watts from the mains, but that's what my Slim is doing. However, the power saver mode, significantly higher power draw than Demon's Souls. We're up to about 115 watts on this one, which is a lot of watts for an efficiency mode. I guess relative to the full power mode, it's the same sort of ratio that we had in Demon's Souls, but this is just seemingly drawing more power than that game. Therefore, the base power load from power saver is higher. That's quite interesting that we see that there, but it's still a big saving. And if we actually move now to the PlayStation 5 Professional, I'm seeing much the same level of power draw here between the two. Unlike Demon's Souls, where it seemed that the Pro was delivering the same sort of experience with lower power, looks much the same here, which, again, kind of curious, but still this one is clearly more taxing on power draw than Demon's Souls. But you are still getting the efficiency advantage up against the base experience. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up here. We've got power saver mode here, which is effectively a green initiative from Sony. It's all about reducing the power draw of the console and, effectively bolstering Sony's green credentials. The question is the extent as to whether people are actually going to use it. It's somewhat odd that you spend so much money on a relatively high performance device and then limit that performance. Slightly odd. To say the least. Now, there is also the theory that this is like a staging ground for what's happening with the handheld. And I do think that there is some level of credibility to that, shall we say, because the nature of the way that efficiency has improved is down to the kind of changes that would have to be instigated for a handheld. Obviously, the CPU side of things, the setup does seem to match what this rumoured Canis processor is doing, 4 cores, 8 threads. That seems to be the case here. And memory bandwidth, it's at a premium in a handheld. And obviously, for the power saver mode, they've kind of locked it down by half. compared that with the kind of efficiency advantages we're expecting from universal compression in RDNA 5, well, maybe it is kind of equivalent. GPU side of things, though, I mean, I guess it is still rather high. The amount of GPU power you've got in power saver mode does seem to be relatively decent, right? And we're seeing pretty high power draw here. So the extent to which, what we're seeing here with like Days Gone, for example, like 115 watts maximum, how that's going to go down to just 15 watts in a handheld, I don't know. I think maybe there's probably things that developers are going to need to do to get that down, whether it's PSSR upscaling, whether it's running at lower resolutions. I mean, both of the games we're looking at here are targeting 1440p and even 4K in the case of Days Gone. I can't see that happening on a handheld. So maybe it's basically a means by which developers are getting to grips with the key limitations of what the handheld is going to be, which is, reduced CPU capabilities and, much more oppressive memory bandwidth. So, yeah, maybe it's just sort of like, as I said, a sort of staging ground for handheld. I don't really want to make any kind of suggestion that what you're seeing here is what the PlayStation handheld is going to look like. I think we've got to see the PlayStation handheld to make that determination, to be honest. But it's all interesting nonetheless. And I guess the thing about the 1440p stuff is that, let's say the handheld has a docking facility, which has been rumoured, then, maybe you would be expecting to see 1440p from it in the way that we've seen some of that from Switch 2, for example. But that's kind of everything we got. Any final thoughts from you, Tom?
Only that it's there's a lot of variables still to factor in with how a PlayStation Portable might turn out, whether it uses RDNA 5, whether there's PSSR upscaling or a future iteration on that. There's a lot of ways that these games, the way these games have been optimized in this power saver state, could be tweaked and changed for a handheld situation. Whether we get a Switch style docked versus portable setup is also, it's a really compelling idea. But then obviously you'd have, for those two different states, you'd need developers to build, optimize for two more styles of playing the game. So it's more work, and obviously developers need to go in and implement that to every game, legacy titles and future titles. So it does put more work on their shoulders. So we'll have to see. It really does feel like this is just a sample, or like the first step of on that road towards more power saving ways to play these games. Mm-hmm. But personally, to be blunt, I wouldn't play a game like this using this power saver mode on the PS5. It's I don't know about you, but it seems like quite a it's a great feature to have. Obviously, there's a lot of, it's to be lauded that they did this. Sony put this in, but practically speaking, am I gonna run the game at 30 FPS, Demon's Souls at 30 FPS with drops to save a few pennies and cents? Probably not. And Days Gone as well, I'm gonna drop it to, reduce the image quality and have drops to 45 FPS. It's a hard sell just to save a few pennies. So yeah, we'll see what happens. I think it's a very interesting insight though into what Sony's trying to do behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm just really looking forward to seeing power saver on an Unreal Engine 5 game that's running already at a really low internal resolution. How are they going to scale that back? I think that's going to be quite an interesting challenge. But I do understand that power saver is integrated into Unreal Engine 5 now, and indeed Unity. So we should be seeing some examples at some point. One thing to point out is that the base PlayStation 5 obviously has to be supported in a project, but the Pro is supposed to be mandatory as well. Power saver mode is entirely at the developer's discretion at the moment. But if this handheld is a thing, and I suspect it is, I suspect that we will be seeing, third-party developers embrace it as they begin this journey to supporting that potential new hardware. Anyway, that's it. That's all we got for this video. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. But please do consider supporting us, patreon.com/digitalfoundry. And check out our merchandising wares at store.digitalfoundry.net. But that's all from us on this one. We'll see you soon. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.